It can feel like you're already familiar with this space before you arrive. That quiet place where nothing is openly wrong, but nothing is fully right either. You're not confused about what's happening. You've been paying attention the whole time. You noticed how they stayed close enough to feel connected, how they reached out just often enough to keep the thread alive, how there was always a sense of being held near, but never fully brought in. And that kind of closeness can be more tiring than distance. You're here with the fatigue of hoping without resting. There's a particular strain that comes from receiving just enough warmth to soften you, enough interest to keep you engaged, enough care to make leaving feel premature. And alongside that, there's the awareness of what never quite arrives, the steadiness, the follow-through, the sense of being chosen without hesitation. You may feel appreciation and longing at the same time, feeling grateful for what exists, while quietly noticing how much you're still waiting for. You might sense the contradiction living in you. One part holding on to the moments that felt sincere, the laughter, the attention, the way they showed up when it counted just enough to matter. And another part noticing how often you adjusted yourself to the pace they set, how you learned not to ask too loudly, how you stayed flexible so the connection wouldn't disappear, wanting to trust the closeness, while also feeling the slow drain of being the one who keeps the emotional momentum moving. There's often a gentle turning inward that happens here. Not harsh, not accusatory, more like careful reflection. Wondering if you're misreading the situation, if you're expecting more than what's fair, if you're holding on to potential instead of reality. Self-doubt can slip in quietly, sounding thoughtful, even generous. You might replay conversations, not to change them, but to reassure yourself that the imbalance isn't imagined, that the pauses felt real, that the hope you carried had reasons, even if it stayed unresolved. Sometimes the hardest part isn't the inconsistency itself. It's how normalized it becomes, how waiting turns into a habit, how hoping starts to feel like loyalty. You may notice how much patience you've practiced without meaning to, how often you stayed emotionally available while clarity remained just out of reach. There's no drama in that, just a slow accumulation of effort that doesn't quite get returned in the same shape. There's no requirement here to name this as anything specific. No need to decide whether it was almost something or simply incomplete. The care that existed can remain real. The lack can remain real too. One doesn't cancel the other. You don't have to turn this experience into understanding or growth. It doesn't need to teach you anything to matter. It can stay exactly as it is, unfinished, still carrying weight. You may notice how much you offered, how consistently you showed up with openness, how often you gave the benefit of the doubt. There's something quietly heavy about that kind of giving when it isn't fully met. Not wrong, just demanding in a way that isn't always obvious at first. You might feel the tiredness now, even if you didn't then. There can also be moments where you remember how carefully you learned to read between the lines, how attuned you became to small shifts in tone or timing, how much attention it took to stay connected without pushing for more. That level of attunement can leave a mark. Not as pain exactly, more like a lingering tension that stays even when nothing is happening in the moment. You may notice how your body still holds that readiness, that quiet alertness, long after the interaction itself pauses. There's a tenderness in acknowledging that, in recognizing how much presence you brought into something uncertain. You weren't careless with your feelings. You were attentive, hopeful, willing to stay with ambiguity longer than most would notice. That doesn't need to be praised or corrected. It can simply be seen, just as it is. There's also the subtle weight of wondering if staying longer than planned changes what you are owed, if your patience shifts the balance without being acknowledged. You may notice how often you quietly measured your own investment, how often you checked your heart's endurance without admitting it to anyone else, and even that quiet monitoring can leave its own ache, a constant companion that doesn't demand answers, but reminds you of what you carried alone. Sometimes you notice the pull between appreciation and frustration, how easy it is to feel touched by what exists while simultaneously aware of what doesn't, how love and longing can coexist without resolution. You may notice how that duality shapes the way you show up, how you give, how you wait. It doesn't make your feelings smaller or wrong. It just makes them complex and true. Right now, there's no pressure to move forward or backward, no need to decide what comes next. You're allowed to rest inside the recognition of how this felt, to let your experience stand without explanation, without minimizing it, without turning it into something else. If it feels okay, you can stay here a little longer. Nothing is asking you to rush.